Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my first episode of my podcast, Our Human Experiences. It's wonderful to have you guys here. This podcast is around just to delve into generational trauma by sharing our genuine human stories. Today, we've got JustJoshinWitcha here to talk about his story. We're going to be delving into what it's like to grow up Christian conservative, all the mental health issues that come from being in that milieu. And it's really just going to be a nice chat. So I hope you guys enjoy.
And this is cheaper than therapy. So,
yes, much cheaper and much more accessible. I will be uploading this podcast on Sunday. So give me a follow, check out my links, and stay tuned. But with that being said, I wanted to say that I did find it really interesting that when we started talking about this, I asked you about your childhood. And the first thing that you said was that you grew up conservative Christian. I would have done the exact same thing. So tell me about your experience growing up.
The Christian part of my upbringing, the conservativeness, it's all kind of tied together. And it's definitely a huge part of my past. I mean, when I think back to what shaped things the most, I think that was part of it. But it's hard not to when, as a child, one of the first things that you hear is if you don't believe this thing, you're going to be tortured for eternity. That's a hard thing for a child to hear. And when you grow up in it and that's normalized, it definitely, every other aspect of your life kind of gets filtered through that lens. Every decision
I like
you
the
make,
way you say that gets filtered.
Yeah, it's, there's so many other things that you should be focusing on, but rather than being allowed to just explore and have fun with those things as you experience life, you're constantly thinking in the back of your head is, how will this affect my relationship with the Lord? And there's this invisible man watching me. Am I going to regret this later? It's very off-putting in hindsight looking at it. It felt normal then because I was told it was normal.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of rules when it comes to growing up in that environment. So what kind of pressure do you feel that put on you?
Um, as I was saying, you can't just experience new things without constantly worrying about whether or not this is going to affect something, and this is going to your whole life feels like it's being tallied. You've got your good marks and your bad marks, and you're constantly worried about every little thing. And I feel like in a way that definitely stunts your growth because you're not allowed to go and experience something new without it being poisoned in a way. There's just every experience feels tainted.
So how do you feel that it affected your relationships with people growing up, kind of having that pressure on all aspects of your life?
It was kind of one of the biggest things for me growing up. That one of the hardest thing is, again, I was very introverted, and it was hard for me to step out and force myself to talk to people. But a big part of the Christian faith is proselytizing. And evangelical churches, the evangelism part of it, where you're supposed to constantly be talking about these things and bringing people in. There's always that feeling of guilt for not bringing it up, even though I wasn't comfortable talking about those things to other people. Even early on, when I knew I was supposed to be trying to force Jesus into every conversation, I was super uncomfortable with it. And so I think, I naturally knew that, forcing your beliefs on people felt wrong. But again, you weren't allowed to, normally you would, if something felt wrong, you would make that association. You'd realize the difference between good and bad. But because you were told that this thing that felt wrong was right, it definitely messed with your head.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those weird things that the church has a habit of doing, kind of like justifying some of its less than likable traits. Like, trying to enforce it on other people is like, well, you're doing this out of love. Meanwhile, you're breaking boundaries with people because they don't want to talk about it. It's, not something that they're willing to do. And that's not something that people who love people do.
There's an otherization of people within the church. And that's, I think as I talk through this, one of the things that always comes back to mind is the double speak, the the hypocrisy of it all, the being told one thing and then in practice it's something else. And so I'm constantly being fed this message of love your neighbor, but then I'm told that doing this horrible thing to them is some sort of perverse form of love. And not being around many people, you sort of separate yourself from the others, from people that don't fit into the picture that you have of what a person is supposed to be. And
Mm,
so, and part of that, I mean, I grew up in a very small town in a red state in Oklahoma. And so I didn't really have access to many divergent personalities. It was a largely white farming conservative town. We had
mm.
some Native American people, but other than that, there was not a lot of diversity. And so,
Right. Now, how about demographic wise, how many people lived in your town? Do you
it's
know?
probably about 1,500, like very small.
Yeah, that is pretty small. I grew up in a semi small town, somewhere between like a town and a village.
Hmm.
Like we have maybe 18,000 people in the entire county, but very very similar.
Yeah, I think
One
I,
thing I have noticed is that when I was growing up, the diversity really wasn't there, but over the years it has changed. But the communities aren't meshing, you know?
yeah, even when I was, like I said, there was a relatively decent sized Native American population. We're down in southwest Oklahoma, which is right in the
Mm,
middle of the we're near, like we're right between the headquarters for the Comanche Nation, the Kiowa, the Creek, and I think the Delaware. There's three or
mm,
four, maybe five tribes that are all within like a 50-mile radius around
mm,
where I grew up. So we had several people,
mhm.
but we didn't always interact in different things. We did in some ways, but we just didn't get that much cultural diversity.
Right. Yeah. And growing up in New York State, we've got all the different, uh, great nations of the Iroquois. The that cultural diversity never really came off of the reservations, though. I just think that maybe it has to do with New York State taxes, maybe, but most of the cultural diversity that we had, historically speaking, was different cultures of white people. We had an Irish part of town. The Italian part of town has Italian flags wrapped around their light posts. A Ukrainian group here, but when I was young, we had a few families, a few black families, and since then it's like really kind of blossomed, which is good. But again, we need that cultural mesh to mix.
Absolutely,
Um,
that's what we when I was around other people, it was most of them were kind of forced into acting as you were expected to in white culture, sort of thing. Like you were exposed to people through high school, but a lot of like the cultural individuality stuff was sort of pushed to the side and not as out and accessible. So it took a
right
little bit to
now,
break down any barriers.
yeah. So this was something that, like you said, like deeply affected every aspect of your life. When we were talking, you were telling me that there were events that happened in your house that really shook things up for you. How did those things affect your relationships with your family, and how did it affect you?
Uh, Again, it kind of goes back to the church. So when I was, I want to say around 11 years old, I don't want to go into too much detail because, again, I don't want to tell someone else's story that's not mine to tell. But without
Mm,
going into too much detail, I found some things that I shouldn't have found that belonged to one of my parents. And the reaction was varied because there were things about it that I found upsetting that wasn't the part that they found upsetting. For them, it was
mm,
that had deviated from the thought behind the church. That's the part that bothered them, and
mm.
so it felt wrong. It felt weird, and ever since then, I've just not had a great relationship with my father. That's really been, I mean, I guess I've outed which parent I was trying to avoid too much of that. But anyway, yeah. So my father and I can't really talk about it without talking about the fact that my
Right.
father and I's relationship was kind of irreparably damaged. We're at a weird place now in my life where we kind of just mutually have, without verbally saying it, agreed to not talk about some things in order to even
Mm,
maintain any kind of relationship. But I found out things about my father that I shouldn't have when I was way too young. And
mm,
my father has a lot of self hatred in himself. He is a very narcissistic person, which you would think meant that you would only love yourself, but he finds his own flaws in me and took them out on me. And so I, from
mm,
that point on, kind of spent a lot of my childhood defending myself and trying to kind of took the brunt of it. Tried to deflect most of it from falling on my mom and my siblings, uh, which definitely affected things. In fact, this last Christmas, I was talking with my mom, and some of this stuff came up, and she kind of kind of floored me because some of these things that I had put out of my memory, it's sort of fuzzy. You know, you don't trauma has a way
mm.
with softening the edges of some of the things that happen. And she was kind of reliving
Absolutely.
some of those and talking about how she ran into one of my old principals around that time period. And so for a period of years thereafter, these discoveries about my father, my schooling suffered. And I was always the gifted and talented kid that was smart and did all his schoolwork and stuff. But for a
Mhm,
couple of years there, I started acting up and not doing homework and things. And my mom was trying to explain to my principal that she ran into what had happened.
mm,
And she was telling me about this conversation she had with her principal. And what she told me was that that was the day that you stopped smiling.
mm.
She talked about how she goes
Yeah,
back through photos and like growing up until that point, I was a happy kid. And then all of a sudden, you can just see the change.
I've honestly had that conversation with my dad. We are talking, kind of trying to reform a relationship, and I was wanting to give a really good Christmas present for my mother. My parents had been divorced by this time, and she didn't have any of the school photos for us kids. So I asked him for the photos so that I could copy them and
Hmm.
make a whole copy for my mom. And he was just like, I've spent a lot of time looking at these photos of yours and just kind of like watching the smile slowly like fade away from your face. And it's true, that trauma definitely has a way of doing that. But
It's rough. And then
how?
digging it back up.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So when you were a kid, I understand growing up in the church, a lot of your mental health issues are like a give it to God kind of thing, bring it to Jesus. And what actual ways did you learn to cope with what was going on?
So I think that the time I stopped smiling was also the time that I started eating very unhealthily. Like that unhealthily, is that a
Mm,
word? Poorly. And I mean, obviously, I'm a big dude, but a lot of that stems from that. I turned to food as kind of my crutch, which I guess people say it could be worse. I'm not on hard drugs, and alcohol hasn't ruined my life.
right.
Um, but everybody has that thing that affects them, and for me, it was sugar. And even though it seems less directly harmful than some other substances, I'm at a point now in my life where it's definitely affected me. I'm only 35 years old, and I have health problems that could have been different if I had taken care of myself better. But
Mm,
I became an emotional eater, and when I was happy, I consumed too much, and when I was sad, I consumed too much. But that was the biggest crutch I fell back on. And in fact, my mom even
mm,
when we were having that conversation, attempted to apologize and say that she realized what I was going through, but she was sort of trapped in this with my father as well, and she knew
mhm.
like she's like I kind of facilitated that, and I'm sorry, but yeah, like I would take you out for stuff because I knew that that was the only time that you were happy, and I liked seeing you happy.
Right. Now, lucky me, my mother was a baker, so
Oh, that makes
that,
it nice.
that yeah, that coping mechanism was definitely there for me as well. It's just weird how all of that kind of aligns. But I did find myself in a lot of after school activities that kept me busy. But I
Yeah.
know that if I didn't, it wouldn't have been any different.
And
Um,
that kind of helped prevent me
so
from getting too bad too. I was also very active in sports and academic like quiz bowl things, and I played football and basketball and stuff. And I think what really affected me is I developed all these bad habits, these coping mechanisms where I overate, but I was still active, and so it sort of kind of balanced itself out. I went from a skinny kid to kind of a pudgy kid, but I wasn't that bad until after
Mm,
high school when I left that support system, and I no longer had 2-a-day practices and sports every day, and so that was kind of
right.
where it really took off and went downhill.
So that being said, why don't we get into what happened once you finally got out and got into college?
Well, so I went to Oklahoma State in 2005, and part of my problem with that is the family were talking about growing up liking sports and stuff. My family were all fans with that, but I didn't go
Mm,
because it was the best school for me academically. I went because we were fans, and really the only good thing that
ooh,
came from it is that's where I met my wife. But the problem is that I had never at that point had any kind of real relationship, and talking about growing up not really knowing how to form a relationship. I sort of
right.
dove all in, which again I'm
Mhm,
thankful that I met my wife. I love her, but I was probably more devoted to her in college than I was to going to school because I had developed those poor
mm.
habits of
Oh, yeah.
didn't need to study, so I
Yeah.
didn't. Things had always come easy, and if they didn't come easy, I didn't want to
Mhm.
do them because, and so um, I only was at Oklahoma State for about 3 semesters and ended up dropping out. Moved in with my girlfriend, who like 4 years later I married, and the
Mhm,
next 10 years with her were very hard. We both worked a lot, and so it wasn't until we were at the point where we were ready to have kids that I finally decided to go back and finish my degree and change some things that had matured enough to handle that. But it definitely
mm.
put me on the long track where some of these things, if I'd made better choices growing up, would have definitely gone through some things faster.
Right. Now, one of the things that you said that I think is interesting is how, you were always like this gifted kid and always able to do things. And then once you got into college, you faced some things that weren't so easy for you and you just didn't like do those things. I kind of relate to that in a way. Do you think that you have like a fear of failure at
Oh,
all?
absolutely. And again, I think that a lot of that comes back to my father. And like I said, he saw a lot of his flaws growing up in me. He saw
Mm,
himself in me, and so the things that he hated about himself, he took out on me. And that sort of manifested itself in this desire to be perfect. I grew up never hearing the words "I'm proud of you" or "You're enough,"
mm,
and so I felt like the only way to gain any kind of approval was to be perfect at something, and a lot of things came naturally, and I was praised for that, and so it was awesome. It's like, but the problem was that if something came along that I wasn't naturally immediately good at, I didn't want to have anything to do with it because
mm.
that crippling fear of not being perfect.
Right. No, I feel that. There's like this weird thing that happens to a lot of people that go through a lot of childhood trauma where our self-worth is affected to this degree that we really don't enjoy going through, some of the more challenging things. Luckily for some of us, there's a lot that comes naturally, but in a way, that's its own curse because things came easy and then we finally get out on our own and now there's things that aren't so easy and now we're just like no, that's going to make us unworthy. We're not going to be perfect, we're not going to be lovable. Some people still in the belief of making a mistake and being deserving of eternal damnation.
And it makes it very hard to progress in your own life because some things, the situation changes. It's not so much that your ability changed, but you suffer from not being able to progress with the situation. And so like schooling
Mm,
as example, well, high school came easy, college not so much. um, and later on you develop those, but like during high school when things came easy, you didn't study, you developed bad habits, you'd go out with friends, but then you go and try to apply that same thing to college where things require a little bit more effort and note taking and
Mhm.
all of those skills. The situation changes, but you are not prepared or capable of changing with that situation. I think it just comes
Mhm.
down to it is very difficult to make those changes.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. The rigid structure that, comes from a, deeply Christian upbringing, we have all these rules and guidelines to live under, and there's always a structure, which is good in some ways and bad in others. I know that there's probably plenty of people who grew up in a house that was super chaotic, didn't have a lot of structure, but in a way, having too much structure also is its own demon. So we're talking about changes, and during this time that you had leaving high school, getting into college, and those years that you were with your wife, you were telling me that you had a lot of slow changes. Kind of delve into that and explain it how it was that you were able to make those changes.
Well, like I said, at where I'm at now is an entirely different person than I was growing up, especially like ideologically and things like that. And a large portion of that is eventually being exposed to diversity. And everyone talks about college being this place where you're indoctrinated. Really, what it is just you're
Right.
finally in a position where you break outside of your echo chamber and you get to hear other perspectives. My problem is,
Exactly. Yeah.
like I said before, I wasn't really good about going to class or doing anything. I sort of dove into this relationship that I had in college, the first round. And so the first round, I never got to make other friends. I really just 100% focused on this one girl. And because of
Mhm.
it, I didn't get that exposure to diversity at that point. It took me the full
Mhm.
10 years before going back to college to finally make friends with other people. And again, I came to it with that Christian perspective of this person is living in sin and I shouldn't be friends with them. But as I got to know them, I started to try and make changes because I realized this is just a real person living their life. This isn't the caricature that was created in my mind growing up. And so,
Mhm.
as I was confronted with that, my worldviews just clashed with what I was taught. And so, slowly and methodically, I tried to change my perspective without changing the origins of like my faith and all of these things. I tried to force this new worldview into the framework. Sorry, bump the mic. Framework of Christianity, and it just wouldn't fit.
Mhm.
And so, eventually,
Right.
the only way to
Right.
to to make these changes was to break out of that frame.
Right. So when you were doing this, like there's a difference between kind of letting the change in and kind of looking for that change. Do you think that about that time that you kind of realized that that framework was the issue? Do you feel like there was that kind of a change there?
Not at the very beginning, but as time went on, I realized that. At first, it was just meeting the first person that I'd ever met in my life who was trans, and meeting the first
Mm.
person in my life that I'd ever actually had a conversation with that was gay. And to me, I'd been told that this was a horrible sin, um, and I just realized that condemning this person and hating this person isn't the best way to do it. And so at first I was like, well, if I want to have a conversation with them and be able to forge a relationship so that I can try to bring them back to Jesus, because that was always the mindset growing up,
Mhm.
that I have to come to them openly and have a conversation. As I talked to them, I started it just the whole idea that they're living in some sort of horrible sin just didn't mesh with what I was actually seeing. This was a kind
Mhm.
person, and it shouldn't take like whether you're a kind person or a bad person, whatever, doesn't make a lifestyle wrong or right. But that was kind of how I saw things at the time. And so seeing this person who I thought was an objectively good person living in a way that I was told was not the right way to live didn't mesh well. And I just couldn't force myself to hate people anymore.
Well, that's good. That's beautiful.
I'm sad that it
um,
took me 30 years of my life to realize that super basic truth.
and yeah, and that's that weird thing. Like I was saying, that backwards way of the church is like it condemns a lot of humanity, but it tells its followers that it's doing so out of love. So like you were out here trying to do your best, thinking that you're doing this, to save somebody's soul, to bring true love into their life, but you know, retrospectively looking at it, it's coming out of a space of hate and condemnation.
And these are the same
So
people telling you that they're the only
from
ones that have the answer of what is morality.
right, and that conversation of being in an echo chamber is like if you only have ever existed in one mindset, how are you so confident that you know the answer? So, with these experiences and this exposure, do you feel that helped deconstruct a lot of the religious trauma that you were still living with growing through your adult life?
It helps start the process. I think realizing that that all these things, that if that was wrong, that other things that I was told could also be wrong, started to kind of chip away. And I keep
Mm,
talking about, I saw things through this great Christian perspective. But if I'm going to be brutally honest, I had those doubts and those questions my entire life because I had a very logical mind and nothing ever perfectly made sense. And so I was always told,
right.
just
Yeah.
have faith, and everyone around you, your family, the elders in your church, and just your teachers, your friends, everyone around you is part of this group. And as far as you know, they 100% believe this. And so you risk being that other if you admit that you have
Hmm.
doubts. And so you're
Yeah.
trying to make up for it. I think a lot of that, going out and trying to live that godly life, is really just trying to convince others that you're part of the group, because we are
Mm,
just a very social species. And when that's the
yeah.
only, like you said, the echo chamber, when that's the only group that you have, um, risking losing your group is losing everything. And so when you finally
Right.
realize that the group is larger and there are other ways to live life, it makes that a little
Yeah.
less scary and a little bit easier to move forward.
That is one of the scary things about like continually living in that echo chamber in that environment is like I feel like a lot of people that still live and are a part of the church are oftentimes walking on eggshells because like when somebody gets told on or somebody gets found out that they've done something, they oftentimes become the black sheep of the herd. They get ostracized and kind of pushed out of the church community where some of these people have lived almost their entire lives in it. So it's a scary thing, facing the idea of being a human who can make mistakes, but those mistakes would leave you to be left out on the streets as
Yeah.
far as community goes.
And
So you grew up in that and you went to college, you got married, and then you started experiencing life, you started growing and having some ideological changes, but did those changes ever reach home?
I wish they would have. I've had conversations with my family trying to get them on board as well. And I feel like there's a thread with my mother that I could possibly pull at to eventually get her on board. But I don't know if I feel like the rest of my
Mhm.
family is too far gone, especially aunts and uncles and all of these things. My mom is
Mm.
willing to listen to things, but you can tell that she's where I was, where that's her group, and it is scary to think about leaving the group.
Right.
Christianity has been her whole life, and she's devoted you know 20, 30 more years to it
Mhm.
than I did. And so at this stage in life, it's hard to get people to think about things from a different perspective. It was hard enough
Mhm.
in my late 20s, early 30s to start to make these changes.
Right.
But I've had knockdown, drag out, verbal, abusive fights with aunts and uncles over things over the last few years. Trump coming to office really sort of solidified my changes, because at that point, when he was elected, I was still registered Republican, and I think that was the first time in my life I didn't vote Republican, because even as
Hmm.
someone on that side, I saw something I couldn't stand and couldn't square with our beliefs. Um,
Right.
People that viewed him as Christian made me like that was almost the final nail in the straw. I was like, if this is what Christian is, I don't want anything to do with it. Um, and
Right.
if this is what being a Republican, being a conservative is, I don't want anything to do with it. And so that's sort of where things started to really speed up. But it was also a
Right.
sticking point with most of my family because they were ride or
Mm,
die red
right.
and unwilling to look at other
I
things.
do have to say that's probably one of the unseen good things that happened when Trump became president is the smoke and mirrors fell away for a lot of people.
Yeah,
Got to kind of see what the GOP was truly all about. Even the softer, less conservative Republicans would, just bend the knee over to all of these really right wing extremist ideology bills that were being passed and all of the comments that were being made. They just, nobody ever stood up for being a decent human being. It was all about that morality from that echo chamber.
hmm they made
Um,
abortion the entire thing. It doesn't matter what
mm,
kind of a monster you're voting for, as long as he supports your views on one single topic, and that
yeah,
was
I
that
would
was it.
say I'd say that there's that. There's quite a bit, honestly, like the anti-trans stuff, the bathroom laws. People
Yeah,
are focusing on bathroom laws way more than they were focused on foreign policy.
right.
It's just so weird. The mentality just seems so backwards.
And
We've
the
got way
irony
more
when you
important
start
things
look
to focus on.
when you finally become willing to look at the facts without just accepting what you're told from the church members, when you hear someone
Right.
arguing about the bathroom laws and using child protection as a justification, and then you look at what's going on in the churches and their refusal to acknowledge that, and you actually look
Absolutely.
at the numbers for the first time, and you're like, this is not the issue. The protecting the children is not. That's just your cover story. I believed the cover story
Exactly.
growing up, but then you start to see things from a different
Mhm.
perspective.
Growing up like Christian, not Catholic Christian, but Protestant, we're given this idea that the Catholic Church is the place where those things happen. It's the Catholic priests that diddle little boys,
Yeah,
but it tracks. It tracks through the whole thing.
my church, we were Missouri Synod Lutheran. You know, so we were one of the first
Hmm.
churches to move away from Catholicism, but we were also not quite like we still had a very rigid structure that was very similar to Catholicism. And yes, I
Right.
remember that a lot, where they put a lot of the blame on, well, that's not like the bad thing. Anything that's bad about Christianity is Catholics or Baptists. In the South, it was a lot of
Right.
Baptists, but
Oh yeah.
that
No,
was
I like to say that I grew up Southern Baptist in rural New York because all the churches that I went to were Baptist, preaching hellfire and brimstone. It's really no different.
yeah.
Uh, you really hardly saw any families that were minorities in those churches, and just all the same, hateful rhetoric was thrown around. It's a very toxic and hateful environment to bring somebody up in. That being said, like working through all of these layers of religious trauma and learning to become who you are outside of that, did you ever have access to healthcare during that time, like mental health care?
I don't know if anything was available. It was not something that I ever sought out because, again, it had been stigmatized. Or maybe not even
Mm,
so much stigmatized as just never discussed. It was never an option in my mind until much, much later. And then it came to the point where I finally, within the last 4 or 5 years, realized there's a lot that I need to unpack, and it would be really beneficial to see a therapist. The problem is, that it is expensive. I know I joked about that when we started, but it is very, very tricky to do that. It's cost
mhm.
prohibitive. We did find somebody briefly for me to talk to through our hospital at the last town that we were in. They had a therapist on board.
Hmm.
However, some of those deep seated things that I wanted to talk about, we never got to. It sort of just became them telling me I needed to lose weight, which I do. But,
Right.
we never got further than that one layer, which was, a lot of my right now problems are like my health issues
Mm,
are due to weight, but we never got to the why
right.
is my weight a problem and
Right.
what are the mental issues to fix.
Mhm.
So
I was actually talking with a friend of mine about this lately because, going through my own stuff, I've really come to take it to heart that we as human beings are mind, body, and spirit all at the same time, um, which is different than like Western culture traditionally thinks about. Like we're a mind and a body, or a spirit and a body. We're just those two parts, and they are completely separate. There's a lot of talk, and I do hear it a lot in the church of like, it really doesn't matter what you do, but who you are on the inside that counts. These aspects of ourselves, they're all one being. So, like, if you do something healthy for your body, it's going to make you feel better mentally, it's going to make your spirit feel better. And that's just kind of how it all works together. I feel in mental health and healthcare in general, there's really a lot lacking in this respect. Like, there's not enough healthcare professionals, like mental health care professionals, to do a very good job. So, the most effective thing that they can do is like give the advice to go to the gym, start eating healthy, because it's retrospectively a lot easier to tell somebody lift a weight than it is to tell them take this week to go delve into this trauma without any mental health tools that you never learned, because it's a lot easier to pick up a weight than do that. And helping your physical health will inevitably help your mentality and your spirituality, but you need all three.
right,
um,
and not addressing the cause, the root issues. So
right, no, definitely, you're not wrong. It seems very dismissive, and I just could never see working that job myself as like a therapist and having hundreds of people come through my door every month, and dealing with that because there's only three of me doing this job in an entire county's worth of people. So like everybody's under a high workload, and anybody that's walking through that door is bringing their own special thing to the table. It's really difficult to imagine doing that job effectively.
oh, absolutely.
But just kind of between the patient and the therapist, there's a lot of issues just because we don't have universal health care. So, getting access to mental health care in the first place is super hard. And then because there's such little access to it, the market for it doesn't really allow it to be something that is a thriving profession that has a lot of, people going into it, a lot of finances and guidelines to make it something that works well for everybody that needs it.
Yep, I agree completely. Absolutely.
So, you've been through all this stuff through, childhood, through your college and marriage and getting back into college. Um, you finished that somewhat recently, right?
Yeah, I just graduated back in 2019. So, and then I'm currently working on my master's at a different college up here in Nebraska where we currently live. Progressing, moving along.
So you're now here at this point in your life. You've got nearly 240,000 followers here on TikTok. What brought you here in the first place?
I think the same answer that a lot of people have was, boredom during the lockdowns early on during COVID.
Oh,
My
yeah.
wife got on it first, and she would constantly send me videos, and I finally decided to hop on. And early on, I knew like it could be a good place to vent, a good place to express some creativity and make videos. And again, like I said, I come from an artistic background. That's what I do. Graphic design, photography, painting, all of those things, and filmmaking as well. And so I kind of already had a background in filmmaking before I came on here. So I understood sort of the basics of editing and some things. Now, obviously, a TikTok is not as high a production as some other videos,
Right.
but just having the general flow of editing down definitely, I think, gave me an advantage. Um, but also, going back to that ideology shift, I was sort of right in the middle of that. Things had just sort of peaked, and we're gearing up for another election, and so all of that sort of culminated in finalizing, for sure. Like I talked about, Trump being what sort of really made everything speed up. I think that it finally came in the full circle when I joined TikTok and was finally able to really hear all of those other perspectives. And of course, not
Hmm.
long after I got on TikTok was the whole the George Floyd incident, and so all of a sudden my
Right.
TikTok is flooded with people talking about these things that I never would have been able to hear before because I just wasn't around the
Right.
right
Now
people
that's
to hear from things.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most unexpected things to come out of TikTok was social activism. Is like you're not the only person who I've interviewed so far that talked to me about like ideological shifts, and getting exposed to TikTok and George Floyd has been the thing, that definitive event that changed a lot of people's minds.
Yeah,
And it's
it was very polarizing. You see that with throughout the country, even outside of TikTok. But there was very few people that were in middle ground on that. You were one side or the other,
right.
and
Yeah.
yeah, that sort of required a stance.
Mm. So having all of this, you're now here. You've got a lot of people watching you, and you're talking about these social activist things. How is it that you mitigate doing this while still trying to have decent relationships with people back at home?
Uh, Honestly, I've done my best to block most of my family members from social media. I It's just one of those things where at this point we're fully at odds on things, and the way I talk on TikTok is probably not the way I would try to talk with a family member if I was trying to get them on there, because I'm very loud and very aggressive on TikTok, and I think a lot of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
comes from. I think when I make a TikTok, the person that I'm talking to isn't so much somebody else as much as it is me. At the old me, the videos that I make are
Mhm.
videos that I wish that it's me trying to slap my younger self upside the face and say, "Listen here, dummy. This is how things really should be." And so I don't know. Maybe it's guilt, it's regret. I don't know what it is, but I feel like
Mhm.
I'm making up lost time. I spent most of my life
Mhm.
living within, with these thoughts of hatred for other people, or not even hatred because it was this warped sense of love, but this disdain
Mhm.
for anyone that lived a lifestyle differently. And as
Yeah.
I've realized how harmful and toxic that was, I want to do everything I can to fix some of that. If I can get
Mhm.
through to one person, it's a success. But yeah, a lot of that is just
Mhm.
how do I, the things that I wish that I could tell myself when I was younger, are things
Mhm.
that I talk about now.
Absolutely. So you kind of do you feel that you're kind of coping with your religious trauma through doing TikToks like that?
I am. It definitely tints my tone a lot. Like I said, I tend to be very
Me
aggressive, and
too.
sometimes some of that, it's a place to vent. And so sometimes I
Mhm.
do come off very aggressive when I'm talking about things like that. And again, it's frustration. I think 30 years of believing the
Mhm.
bullshit and finally getting out of it. It's hard for me to. I and maybe I'll get there eventually, but at this point, I'm not at the stage where I can have a calm conversation about it and say, hey, there's good on both sides. Let's talk this through.
Mhm.
It's more like, no, this is garbage, and you shouldn't be believing this garbage. And that's where I'm at now,
Right.
because again, like I said, I feel like I'm talking to myself, but I'm hoping to get to a point
Yeah.
where I can have more of those conversations that might be a bit more beneficial, and come off less
Mhm.
scathing.
Yeah, that's it's interesting talking about this right now because over the past week I've had conversations with people about this in a way. And something that I've definitely gotten comfortable in realizing is like I don't have to worry so much about being better than who I used to be. or being better than my father, because that ship sailed long ago. I'm very comfortable and confident that I am just in general a really great person. So like at this point, I think the way that I still feel about the church, that vitriol that I still have is kind of not serving me anymore. As much as it really gets to me, somebody told me that I'm going to have to let that go. And I guess the only reason why I would be holding on to it is just to be able to hold on to those, like you were saying, those regrets for who I used to be to kind of make up for lost time. But I'm confident that who I am now is just so much better that that's all in the past for me. I don't know if that's a way that might help you think about it, but
I
letting go is not easy.
I definitely respect that, and part of me is definitely envious, and I that is a goal that I hope to get to. I'm aware that I'm not at that place yet, but hopefully I can work towards that.
That'd be great. I'd love to see that for you. I'm not gonna lie, like your content was some of the content that I started watching when I was watching TikTok. Some of the stuff that was coming out from you after George Floyd changed a lot of my opinions and views on things as well. So like it'd be wonderful to see you get on the other side of this. Like it's not that I'm on the other side of it yet, but I'm getting there. I definitely see the end for me.
Yeah.
So it'd be great to see you there too. But it's this whole talk, this whole podcast idea is just about how important that exposure is. Talking to people about things, hearing different perspectives, just the importance of having an open mind. That being said, outside of how challenging this has been for the relationships you've had and the relationship that you have with yourself, what are some other challenges that you face as a creator?
I mean, besides the constant death threats, I don't take
Oof.
most of those seriously, but it comes with the territory. When you're going to say some inflammatory things, it's going to piss some people off. So yeah, that just it comes with the
Mhm.
territory. So yeah, while there's great things about TikTok, there's definitely it can take a hit on your mental health. You see a lot of
Mm.
hate, you receive a lot of hate constantly, but
Right.
also you become obsessed with the numbers very easily. And while the logical part of your brain is saying that this doesn't matter, um, the more base primal part of your brain that's addicted to that little hit of serotonin when
Dopamine.
you achieve virality,
Yeah.
uh, it's very addictive, and so you become obsessed with it. And when the numbers stop or they're a little bit slower for a little while, um, then it can definitely take a hit on your mental health, and so you've got to learn how
Mhm.
to cope with that and learn to step away occasionally.
Right. So, with that being said, do you have any other like hopes or aspirations to get back into doing therapy? I mean, getting your master's, being a father, and that's a lot of work.
Yeah, and I started a new position with the school as well. I've got a graduate assistant position with the athletic department where I'm doing graphics and videos and stuff. So I'm working on freelance projects. I'm working at the school. I'm working on my master's at the school, and I'm raising kids and all these things. So I just don't have a lot of time, of free time. But yeah, I it is stressful, and I need to find a way eventually to get back to that and budget that time for my own sake. We actually did speak with a counselor, not so much for myself, but for my kids recently.
Mm.
They've been going through some different things, and part of it we've just moved them, to a different state.
Right.
They're in first. We
Mhm.
have twin 6-year-old boys, by the way. They'll be 7
Oh
next month,
wow.
uh, or 2 months from now, June. I think it's. Are we still in April? Yeah, we're still in April. But
Yeah.
anyway, they're in first grade here, and the move has been difficult. And there's been a couple behavioral things, and we've worked on different parenting structures. But we thought, it's something that I wasn't able to have growing up, but I don't want that to be stigmatized for them. And so we're trying
Right.
early on to give them access to a place where they can talk about things and get the help that
Mhm.
we need to make sure that they are mentally stronger than we were growing up.
Mhm. No, that's a huge thing. And giving your kids access to that at such a young age is fantastic. Like, I recognize how a lot of what I went through, not only as a kid, but growing up as an adult, could have been dealt with better simply if I had had access to that kind of care at a young age. Because my parents, they lacked a whole hell of a lot of tools. I was just talking with my sisters yesterday about it, and it's like our parents handed us sledgehammers to deal with our problems. And rather than teaching us how to use it, they taught us how to stab people in the back with them. And so it's like those tools are the ones that the tools that our parents give us are the ones that we go through our life with.
Yeah.
And once we finally get out and get on our own is when we start learning our own tools. So giving your children access to that, other perspective through therapy or counseling is extremely important to allow them to have more tools to start their life off more than what we had when we were kids.
Yeah, I want to give them as like I said, I realize that the whole thing is a process, and I can see that I'm not at the end of my process. I still have a lot of work to do, but the earlier that you can start, the better, and that's what I want to give them, and that's what I'm trying to work with myself is acknowledging that letting go of that desire for perfection and realizing that it's going to take time and work and effort. One of the metaphors I use actually, so back in 2019, I started growing my hair out. Don't know why, just my parents had never let me do that growing up, and so I started in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember distinctly when I first got on TikTok having to go through that really awkward middle stage. And so I compare a lot of this to
I've
the
been through that twice now.
yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. Like there's that weird middle stage, and I feel like when I first got on TikTok, that's where I was with hair, but also ideologically. And so you try to
Mm,
compensate a lot. And I feel like when I first started talking about social issues and things, I was so awkward, and I'm still very awkward when it comes to a lot of things. And I still put my foot in my mouth, and I still make mistakes. And just acknowledging that it will get better, it will eventually not be quite so awkward. Because I could tell early on when I was at that point where like I'm going to now accept gay people while also trying to be Christian. And I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, but it was one of those awkward stages where I tried too hard, and so then if I had a
mm.
friend who was living that lifestyle, I went out of my way to talk about how accepting I was of them to the point where it was probably really uncomfortable for them. And I apologize if any of
Yeah,
them see this or
yeah.
hear this.
Oh, I'm
It took
sorry.
me
That
time.
is hilarious. That's hilarious. That's like one of those cliche things that when you look back on it, you have to laugh at it, or at least
I
let
hope
other people laugh
so.
at it.
I've got some really good friends that again, it's like I've got friends that, but I've got some people that I've been able to talk through that have seen me kind of go through this stage where now it's like, you know, if you're going to accept somebody as a person, then just accept them as a person and don't make that poor like there's making that aspect of someone's life their entire what you understand of them in a negative way or a positive
Hmm.
way. Um, and so, just whereas you could like look at somebody and say, "Well, you're gay, nothing else," and I hate you for it. You could also go a little bit too far and be like, "Well, you're gay, and that's all you are, and I love you for it," and it's really uncomfortable still. And so,
Yeah,
hopefully, I'm finally over that
extremely.
hill where I can just people are just people. I still talk about
Hmm.
things a lot on here, but I can like exist and have a conversation without making that the main topic.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, it's a long, hard road. Growing up from there, we're basically taking it from all the way to the right and trying to push ourselves as far as we can towards the rest of humanity.
Yes.
Do you have any hopes or aspirations for the future?
Like I said, just continuing that mental health journey and hopefully getting to a point where I can let go of some of the anger that I still have. Because I know a lot of that anger tempers things. And even though I try to put it, like I try to give it a comedic spin, I mean, that's my nature. That's another one of the coping mechanisms of how I deal with things. I have some very dark jokes that I tell sometimes because that's also how I cope with things. But,
Hmm.
letting go of that, I don't want to let it destroy me. It's not worth it.
No, I get that 100%. So, with all that being said, if you have any advice or any lesson that you could tell anybody in the world, what would it be?
That's a really good question. Surround yourself with the right people. Um, I know we talk about the echo chamber part of it. You want to. It's a double edged sword. You want the right people around you, but so finding the right people requires you to go out and seek diversity. But when you find those good people, keep them is probably better advice. Don't just surround yourself with your close
Mm,
friends that are going to tell you what you want to hear. Find the people that'll tell you what you need to hear, and keep them close. I wish that I'd
mm.
had the kind of friends that I could have felt comfortable opening up with and talking about these things early on. And
Right. Talking about those doubts that you had.
luckily I've made
Yeah.
those friends, and a lot of them through TikTok. I've got some really good people on
Mm,
here uh, that I became mutuals with early on. That we've had some great conversations in the past and gotten through it. Not trying to name drop, but North Omaha Cat Lady is definitely one of my favorite, one of my best friends, and she often will
nice.
text me and let me have it when I've done something wrong. So uh, it's good to have somebody that'll shoot straight with you.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that advice. Thank you for coming on here, being the first person on my podcast. And thank you for like being vulnerable, sharing your story. I really appreciate that. I'm sure there will be plenty of people that appreciate it as well.
Well, I
Um,
appreciate you having me, and thank you for suffering through my awkwardness, my my attempt at public speaking.
no, it's all right. You and I are fairly the same on that matter. No worries. But that'll be it for tonight's podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, I have way more in store. Next week, I will be here on a TikTok live with the 6 Foot Smoke Show, talking about growing up Pacific Northwest in suburbia and how those pressures have played out in her life. Um, I want to thank you again, Josh, for being here, and I hope that you guys have found something that can help shed light onto a little bit of your own lives. Please, if you feel free, comment, share, subscribe, like whatever you want to do. It helps me create this content. It'll help me continue on this project. With that being said, stay elevated, my friends. All right.
All right, we got through it.
Yeah. Yeah. That was like a lot more chill and a lot more smooth than I thought it was going to be, because nothing ever goes that clean.
I'm glad you say that because I felt so
But I
awkward.
really
Like
appreciate it.
I feel like I was anything but chill.
Ah, you were great. You were fan-fucking-tastic.
Oh, thank goodness.
Um, so, I don't know if you've remembered to stop recording,
I'm
but
pulled it up now. Pulled it up now.
um,
Pulled it up now.